More than 60 years have passed since the Beverly Hillbillies first appeared on CBS in the fall of 1962, and the people who made America laugh at that simple, brilliant premise, a mountain family strikes oil and moves to Beverly Hills, went on to live lives filled with fame, scandal, hidden pain, and quiet reinvention that few viewers at the time could have imagined. One of them was murdered in one of the most infamous crimes in American history, while she was nearly 9 months pregnant with her first child. Another slid slowly into Alzheimer's disease, unable to remember the show that had made him famous. A third became a bitter political enemy of the co-star who had headlined the show for 9 years, and he went out of his way to help defeat her in a congressional race. And the man everyone remembered as the lovable, slow-witted nephew was, in real life, the son of a heavyweight boxing champion, and had earned a college degree with a philosophy minor. This is what really happened to the cast of one of the most watched sitcoms in American television history. If you remember only one guest character from the very first season of The Beverly Hillbillies, it is probably the impossibly refined, impossibly effete Sonny Drysdale, the spoiled stepson of the Clampett's banker, briefly presented to Ellie Mae as a suitable Beverly Hills suitor, and immediately magnificently unfit for the role. Behind that character was one of the sharpest comic performers of the early television era, Louis Nye. He was 49 years old when the show premiered, and he had already spent more than a decade making the country laugh in ways almost none of the show's fans quite realized. Louis Nye was born on May 1st, 1913, in Hartford, Connecticut, to a Jewish family. He found his voice on the radio in the 1940s, served in the United States Army during World War II, and when television began to explode across American living rooms in the 1950s, Nye found himself in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. His breakthrough came on The Steve Allen Show, where he created a character named Gordon Hathaway, a preening country club snob whose catchphrase, "Hi-ho, Steverino," entered the American vocabulary. Nye stood alongside Don Knotts, Tom Poston, and Bill Dana in what television historians now consider one of the finest comedy ensembles of the entire era. When The Beverly Hillbillies was being cast, Sonny Drysdale was a natural extension of the persona Nye had already perfected. Nye played Sonny in 6 episodes of the first season. He received more viewer mail for that character than for anything else he had ever done on television. And then, without any warning, the character was quietly dropped. Nye later revealed the reason with a small, sharp smile. Someone at CBS, or perhaps a nervous sponsor, had decided that Sonny was too sissified for a family sitcom. He briefly revived Sonny during the 1966 season, and once more in the 1993 television reunion movie, The Legend of the Beverly Hillbillies. After leaving the Clampett estate behind, Nye kept working steadily for the rest of his life. He appeared on nearly every major variety show of the 60s and 70s. He provided voices for the Inspector Gadget animated series. Younger audiences discovered him again in his 80s, when Larry David cast him in Curb Your Enthusiasm. The same dry, perfect timing, older but entirely intact. Louis Nye died on October 9, 2005, at his home in Los Angeles of lung cancer at the age of 92. He had been quietly one of the great comic voices of the century, and few people ever quite realized it. She was the impossibly snobbish, blue-blooded Boston society lady who lived next door to the Clampetts and spent 9 years horrified by their existence. Harriet MacGibbon brought a specific kind of aristocratic scorn to the role of Margaret Drysdale that made the character genuinely funny rather than merely mean. She was 56 years old when the show began, and behind the finishing school poise was a life that, quietly, was far more interesting than the character she played. Harriet Elizabeth MacGibbon was born on October 5, 1905, in Chicago, Illinois, the daughter of Dr. Walter Peter MacGibbon, a respected physician. She was descended on her mother's side from Elisha Deming, an Indiana abolitionist who had helped run the Underground Railroad more than a decade before the Emancipation Proclamation. For MacGibbon, upper-class bearing was not something she needed to invent. She attended the Knox School in Cooperstown, New York, preparing for Vassar, and then, in a decision that must have disappointed her family, left before receiving her diploma. She trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City, and by 1925, at the age of 19, she was making her Broadway debut in beggar on horseback. Nearly 40 years of stage work followed. She toured the country opposite former world heavyweight boxing champion Jack Dempsey in The Big Fight, played leading roles for Henry Duffy in San Francisco, and worked steadily on radio in the 30s before her slow move into television. When Paul Henning cast her as Margaret Drysdale in 1962, MacGibbon was already a veteran with nearly 4 decades of stage experience behind her. She played the role from the pilot through the 1969 season. In private, according to nearly everyone who worked with her, she was warm, unpretentious, and generous. Nothing at all like the character audiences knew. Her personal life carried real grief. Her first marriage, to William Reno Cain, ended in divorce in 1942. Her second marriage, to Yale graduate Charles Corwin White, lasted 25 years, until his death on Christmas Day, 1967, right in the middle of her run on the show. Her only child, an art historian named William, died in 1977 at the age of 44, predeceasing her by a decade. She continued working occasionally in the 70s and early 80s, but the losses had accumulated. Harriet MacGibbon died of heart and lung failure on February 8, 1987, in Beverly Hills at the age of 81. Her ashes were placed in the Columbarium of Remembrance at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills. The blue-blooded snob who terrorized the Clampetts had, in real life, been something entirely quieter, and something considerably more graceful. She was Jethro's mother, the loud, warm, magnificently unrefined cousin Pearl Bodine, who wandered in and out of the first 2 seasons of the show as a kind of raucous echo of the Ozark mountain world the Clampetts had left behind. Bea Benaderet made the character unforgettable, and yet almost no viewer of the day realized that they had been hearing her voice, in one form or another, for nearly 3 decades. She was 56 years old when The Beverly Hillbillies premiered, and she had probably been in more American living rooms than any other actor on the show. They just hadn't known it was her. Beatrice Benaderet was born on April 4, 1906, in New York City. The daughter of a Turkish Sephardic Jewish immigrant father named Samuel and an Irish-American mother named Margaret O'Keefe. The family moved to San Francisco when she was small, and she grew up on the West Coast. By the 1940s, she was one of the most in-demand radio voices in America, working on Fibber McGee and Molly, on the Jack Benny program as telephone operator Gertrude Gearshift, and dozens of others. Her voice work at Warner Brothers is a genuine hidden legacy of 20th century American animation. She was the original voice of Granny in the Tweety Bird cartoons, and Miss Prissy in the Foghorn Leghorn shorts. Because of a contractual clause protecting Mel Blanc's exclusive on-screen credit, her name almost never appeared. And in 1960, when Hanna-Barbera launched The Flintstones, it was Bea Benaderet's warm, worldly voice that gave Betty Rubble her personality for the show's first 4 seasons. By the time The Beverly Hillbillies arrived, Bea and creator Paul Henning had been collaborators for years. He had actually wanted her to play Granny. But when Irene Ryan walked into the audition with her hair pinned back in a bun, it was Benaderet herself who nudged Henning and said, "There's your Granny." She was cast instead as Cousin Pearl, and within a year, Henning had built her an entire show of her own. Petticoat Junction, where she starred as Kate Bradley, the widowed owner of the Shady Rest Hotel. That series became a genuine cultural phenomenon in its own right, running from 1963 to 1970. She never had a chance to see it end. Bea Benaderet was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1967. She continued working through the illness as long as she was able. She died on October 13, 1968, at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles at the age of 62. Her husband, sound effects technician Gene Twombly, died of a heart attack just 4 days later. Grief, everyone who knew them said, taking him almost immediately. The woman who had spent decades as one of the most heard, least recognized voices in American entertainment had finally been given a starring role. She only got to enjoy it for 5 years. Some of the most tragic stories in Hollywood begin quietly, in the background of shows the actors never intended as their real work. Sharon Tate joined The Beverly Hillbillies in the 2nd season in October of 1963 as Janet Trego, a shy bank secretary in Milburn Drysdale's office who occasionally caught Jethro's eye. She was 20 years old when she began the recurring role. She would be dead within 6 years, and her death would define one of the darkest turning points in American cultural history. Sharon Marie Tate was born on January 24, 1943, in Dallas, Texas, the eldest daughter of an Army intelligence officer named Paul Tate. The family moved constantly because of her father's postings: Houston, El Paso, San Francisco, and eventually Verona, Italy. By her teens, she was winning beauty contests in every town the family passed through. Her turn toward acting was almost inevitable. She appeared in The Beverly Hillbillies from late 1963 through early 1965 in about 15 appearances, wearing a black wig producer Paul Henning had asked her to put on, so she wouldn't overshadow Donna Douglas as the show's designated blonde. She was very green as a performer. Director Joe Depew later admitted, with some fondness, that when they first got her, she couldn't even walk through the door convincingly. She took acting lessons, improved, and moved on. Then came the run of parts that were supposed to make her a star: Valley of the Dolls in 1967, for which she earned a Golden Globe nomination as Most Promising Newcomer, and Roman Polanski's The Fearless Vampire Killers the same year. She married Polanski, the Polish director, in London in January of 1968. By the summer of 1969, she was almost 9 months pregnant with their first child, a son they had already decided to name Paul. On the night of August 8, 1969, Sharon was at home at 10,050 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles with 3 friends: hairstylist Jay Sebring, screenwriter Wojciech Frykowski, and coffee heiress Abigail Folger. Polanski was in London finishing pre-production on his next film. Sometime after midnight, 4 followers of Charles Manson entered the property. What happened over the next several hours is one of the most infamous massacres in American criminal history. Sharon Tate was murdered along with her 3 friends and a teenage visitor named Stephen Parent. She was 26 years old. Her unborn son died with her. The tragedy shattered 1960s Hollywood. Her mother, Doris, became one of the most influential victims' rights advocates in the United States, personally leading the campaign for decades to keep her daughter's killers from being released on parole. The girl who had appeared uncertainly in a black wig on a light comedy about hillbillies in Beverly Hills had become, without wanting to, the face of a lost American innocence. Her small roles on The Beverly Hillbillies have never stopped being watched, and every time she appears on screen, viewers who know what happened to her feel for a moment an unmistakable chill. The greedy, panic-stricken, endlessly scheming banker who lived in constant terror of losing the Clampetts' money was the second most recognizable face on the show, after Jed himself. Raymond Bailey brought a specific comic desperation to Milburn Drysdale that made him unforgettable, a character whose entire personality could be summarized as fear of losing an account. He was 58 years old when the show began, and the ending of his story, when it came, was genuinely sad. Raymond Thomas Bailey was born on May 6, 1904, in San Francisco, California, the son of William and Alice Bailey. He wanted to be a movie star from his teenage years and moved to Hollywood as soon as he could. He discovered quickly that ambition was not enough. He worked as a day laborer at a silent film studio and was fired for sneaking into a mob scene. He tried New York, no better. So he became a merchant sailor and spent years traveling on freighters through China, Japan, Hawaii, the Philippines, and the Mediterranean. He also worked at various points as a stockbroker and a banker, training that, years later, would give his portrayal of Milburn Drysdale an authenticity nobody else on the show could match. He finally made his film debut in 1938. From there came a slow but distinguished career as a character actor. The Caine Mutiny opposite Humphrey Bogart, Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, and appearances in Sabrina, Picnic, and The Great Race. He was a familiar, dependable presence, the kind of actor casting directors called when they needed a specific type of American executive, banker, or judge. Then came Milburn Drysdale in 1962. Bailey was 58, and the role transformed his career overnight. He played it for 9 seasons, every episode, and in the process became one of the most recognizable faces in 1960s American comedy. Behind the scenes, he was close friends with Nancy Kulp, who played his assistant Miss Hathaway. He called her Slim. They stayed in touch for the rest of his life. After The Beverly Hillbillies ended in 1971, Bailey made a handful of smaller appearances, the Disney comedies Herbie Rides Again, and The Strongest Man in the World. And then, quietly, he began to disappear. The first symptoms of Alzheimer's disease had appeared during the final season of the show. Those who watched carefully could see it. By 1975, he was no longer able to work. He and his wife Gaby divided their time between a small condominium and a houseboat in Laguna Niguel, California. He grew reclusive. Old friends could not always reach him. Raymond Bailey died of a heart attack on April 15, 1980, in Irvine, California, at the age of 75. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered at sea, a final, quiet return to the ocean that had once carried him around the world. The man who had played America's most anxious banker had come home. The impossibly efficient, bird-watching, Jethro-adoring bank secretary at the heart of the Drysdale office was Nancy Kulp's greatest role, and, in a way, her greatest disguise. Behind that dry, hyper-competent character was a woman who had lived several extraordinary lives before the show and would go on to live another one after it. She was 41 years old when The Beverly Hillbillies premiered. Nancy Jane Kulp was born on August 28, 1921, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She earned her bachelor's degree in journalism from Florida State University and pursued a master's at the University of Miami. During World War II, she enlisted in the Waves, the Women's Naval Reserve, and served as a lieutenant, a fact almost no one who watched her on television ever knew. In the years that followed, she worked as a newspaper journalist, profiling figures as varied as Clark Gable and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and eventually landing at the MGM publicity department in Los Angeles. She had never intended to be an actress, but George Cukor, the great Hollywood director, happened to spot her at MGM and told her flatly that she was wasting herself behind a desk. She made her film debut that year at the age of 30. Small parts followed on Our Miss Brooks and The Bob Cummings Show. When Paul Henning was building The Beverly Hillbillies, he wrote the character of Miss Jane Hathaway specifically for her. The role gave her the career she had never imagined. It also gave her a co-star whose politics would eventually collide catastrophically with her own. Nancy Kulp was a lifelong liberal Democrat. Buddy Ebsen was a committed conservative Republican. On set, they were professional. Off set, they simply did not get along. And in 1984, Kulp returned to Pennsylvania to run as the Democratic candidate for the state's 9th congressional district, against 6-term Republican incumbent Bud Shuster. She was an underdog from the start, in a district that had been solidly Republican for over a decade. But she ran a real campaign. She believed in what she was doing. What she did not expect was for Buddy Ebsen, her television co-star of 9 years, a man with no ties to Pennsylvania at all, to record a radio ad for her opponent. "You're too liberal for me," Ebsen said on tape. "I've got to go with Bud Shuster." Kulp lost decisively, taking 33.6% of the vote. She was, by her own later admission, absolutely stunned. She said publicly that she never would have done that to him, and did not speak to Ebsen for years afterward. The two eventually reconciled, at least in some form, before Kulp's death. But the wound never entirely closed. She returned to acting sporadically in the late 80s. She was Arsenio Hall's very first guest on his talk show, sitting in with the house band. She continued to advocate for causes she cared about. Nancy Kulp died of cancer on February 3, 1991, in Palm Desert, California, at the age of 69. Her headstone in Mifflintown, Pennsylvania, bears the inscription she asked for: Miss Jane Hathaway. She had made peace with the role that defined her, even as she remained until the end, a great deal more than the woman on the screen. Some faces on television are inseparable from the sunlight of the era in which they appeared. Donna Douglas was one of them. As Ellie Mae Clampett, the tomboyish, animal-loving, impossibly beautiful daughter of the Clampett family, she embodied a specific kind of Southern warmth that made the character genuinely beloved for 9 full seasons. She was 30 years old when the show premiered. Her birthday, in fact, was the day of the premiere itself, September 26, 1962. A strange, quiet coincidence that made the moment feel almost destined. Doris Ione Smith was born on September 26, 1932, in Pride, Louisiana, a small community outside Baton Rouge. Her father worked for Standard Oil. She was raised Catholic, attended St. Gerard Catholic High School, and was part of the first graduating class the school ever produced. She was a genuine athlete, softball and basketball. And by her teenage years, she had also entered the world of beauty pageants. She married her first husband, Roland Bourgeois Jr., in 1949 at the age of 17. They had one son, Danny, in 1954, before divorcing that same year. After being crowned Miss Baton Rouge and Miss New Orleans, she moved to New York and began modeling, which led to appearances on the variety shows of Perry Como, Steve Allen, and Ed Sullivan. Warner Brothers took notice. Her film work in the late 1950s included Career opposite Dean Martin and Shirley MacLaine, and Lil Abner. She turned up on The Twilight Zone in one of the most famous episodes of that series, The Eye of the Beholder, where her face was covered in bandages until the final reveal. Then came Ellie Mae, and everything else vanished into that character. Douglas loved playing her. She said so publicly for the rest of her life. On set, she became close friends with Buddy Ebsen. In 1971, the same year the show ended, she married the show's director, Robert Leeds. That marriage ended in 1980. Her only theatrical starring role after the Beverly Hillbillies was opposite Elvis Presley in the 1966 musical Frankie and Johnny. She turned away from Hollywood in the 70s. She earned a real estate license. And then, most importantly, she returned to Louisiana and to the faith she had been raised in. She began singing gospel music professionally, releasing her first album in 1982 and several more after. She traveled the country as an inspirational speaker, addressing church groups, youth ministries, and Christian children's homes. She wrote several books, both for adults and for children. Mattel released an Ellie Mae Barbie doll in 2010. She continued attending fan events as long as her health allowed. Donna Douglas died of pancreatic cancer on January 1, 2015, in Zachary, Louisiana, at the age of 82. She had once said that the two things fans always asked her about were whether she still loved critters and whether she could still whistle like Ellie Mae. The answer, she said with a laugh, was yes to both. He was the character everyone remembered, the tall, cheerful, wonderfully dim nephew who believed his 6th grade education entitled him to a career as a brain surgeon, a Hollywood producer, or an international spy. Max Baer Jr. brought a specific, unforgettable warmth to Jethro Bodine that made the character both funny and lovable across 9 seasons and 274 episodes. He was 24 years old when the show premiered, and behind that dim-witted persona was one of the most sharply intelligent men on the entire cast. Maximilian Adelbert Baer Jr. was born on December 4, 1937, in Oakland, California. His father was the former heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Max Baer Sr., who had held the title in 1934 and remained one of the most famous figures in American sport. His uncle was heavyweight contender Buddy Baer. His brother James arrived in 1941, his sister Maud in 1943. He grew up in the shadow of a very large and very famous name. Almost nothing about Max Baer Jr.'s real background matched his character. He earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from Santa Clara University in 1959, with a minor in philosophy. He had wanted briefly to go into the family boxing business, but his father had discouraged him. He had seen what the ring did to men. Baer went to work in banking after graduation, and then, almost on a whim, tried acting. His real Hollywood beginning came in 1960 at Warner Brothers, where he took bit parts on Maverick, Cheyenne, and 77 Sunset Strip. 2 years later, he auditioned for the role of Jethro. He also played Jethro's twin sister, Jethrine, in drag, with Linda Kay Henning's voice dubbed over his own. The dual role gave him room to develop a specific comic identity. Kids across America imitated him. The show made him famous, and it also, almost immediately, boxed him in. For 3 years after the show ended in 1971, Baer could not find serious acting work. He was Jethro to every casting director in Hollywood, and Jethro was not a role anyone else was writing. So he did what few actors of that era ever dared. He wrote himself out of the trap. In 1974, he wrote, produced, and starred in Macon County Line, a low-budget Southern thriller in which he played a murderous sheriff pursuing 2 innocent brothers. Made for about $110,000, it earned more than $20 million and held the record as the most profitable independent film in American history until 1999. He wrote, produced, and directed The Wild McCullochs the following year, and produced and directed Ode to Billy Joe in 1976. In an industry that had refused to see him as anything but a fool, he had proven he could be one of its shrewdest independent producers. He declined to appear in the 1981 television reunion movie Return of the Beverly Hillbillies, and his character had to be recast. He spent decades trying to build a Jethro-themed casino and hotel in Nevada, a project that consumed enormous amounts of time and money and never fully came to fruition. Today, in 2026, Max Baer Jr. is 88 years old and living in Lake Tahoe, Nevada, the last surviving member of the main cast. The son of the boxing champion, the philosophy minor, the man everyone thought was Jethro, still here. There has never been another Granny. Irene Ryan's performance as Daisy Mae Moses, the tiny, feisty, moonshine-making mother-in-law of Jed Clampett, was one of the most beloved comic creations in the history of American television. She stole every scene she stepped into. She never coasted. She was 59 years old when the show premiered, and by that point, she had already spent nearly 50 years on stages across America. Jessie Irene Noblitt was born on October 17, 1902, in El Paso, Texas. The daughter of a United States Army sergeant and an Irish immigrant mother, she made her show business debut at the age of 11 and never stopped. By the 1920s and 30s, she was a headliner on the vaudeville circuit. A diminutive redhead with tremendous comic timing, working the best halls in the country, including the Palace Theater on Broadway. Teamed with her first husband, Tim Ryan, she performed as the duo Tim and Irene on radio through the 30s and early 40s. She toured with Bob Hope on his USO trips, becoming known within the industry as the gal who makes Bob Hope laugh. When Paul Henning began casting the Beverly Hillbillies in 1962, he had originally wanted Bea Benaderet for the role of Granny. Irene Ryan walked in with her hair pinned back in a bun, delivered her lines with maximum feistiness, and the decision changed on the spot. Benaderet, as she recalled years later, pointed at Ryan and said, "There's your Granny." Ryan received 2 consecutive Emmy nominations for the role, in 1963 and 64. She threw herself into the show for 9 years without ever losing steam. When the Beverly Hillbillies ended in 1971, Ryan announced that she was finally going to fulfill a lifelong dream. She was going back to Broadway. In October of 1972, at almost 70 years old, she made her Broadway debut in Bob Fosse's musical Pippin as Berthe, the title character's grandmother. Her show-stopping number, No Time at All, a jubilant, life-affirming song about refusing to waste a moment, became one of the most talked-about performances of the season. She was nominated for a Tony Award for Best Featured Actress in a Musical. She lost in a ceremony held about a month before her death to Patricia Elliott in A Little Night Music. On March 10, 1973, during a performance of Pippin at the Imperial Theater in New York, Irene Ryan suffered what appeared to be a stroke. She flew home to California on her doctor's orders and was hospitalized. Doctors then discovered the real cause, an inoperable glioblastoma, an aggressive brain tumor. She was reportedly never told the diagnosis. Irene Ryan died at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, California, on April 26, 1973, at the age of 70. She left the bulk of her estate to fund the Irene Ryan Acting Scholarship, which continues today through the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival, supporting outstanding student performers across the United States. The tiny woman from El Paso, Texas, had spent nearly 6 decades making America laugh. And she made sure that when she was gone, the laughter would keep going. And finally, him. The man without whom the Beverly Hillbillies would have been just another rural comedy on a crowded schedule. Buddy Ebsen brought a quiet, grave dignity to Jed Clampett that anchored the entire show. He was the still center around which the chaos moved. He was 54 years old when the series began, and behind him lay a career and a survival story that were, in the truest sense, remarkable. Christian Rudolph Ebsen Jr. was born on April 2, 1908 in Belleville, Illinois, the son of a Danish-born dance instructor. The family moved to Orlando, Florida, when he was still a boy. and dance became the organizing principle of his young life. He and his sister Vilma performed as a duo in vaudeville, made it to Broadway by the 1930s, and were signed by MGM. He danced on screen with Judy Garland in Broadway Melody of 1938, a genuinely joyful sequence that captured how good he was. Then, in 1938, came the moment that nearly ended his life. MGM cast him as the Scarecrow in a new musical adaptation of L. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz. Ray Bolger, however, convinced the studio to swap roles with him. Bolger wanted the Scarecrow, Ebsen would play the Tin Man. Ebsen was fine with the switch. He recorded his musical numbers and began 10 days of filming. The Tin Man's silver skin was created with an aluminum powder makeup brushed on daily. Ebsen inhaled it day after day until his lungs began to fail. He was rushed to the hospital in respiratory collapse. He later wrote, "My breathing was excruciatingly labored. No oxygen seemed to reach my lungs. I wondered if I was dying." He nearly did. MGM replaced him with Jack Haley, without telling Haley what had happened, and quietly reformulated the makeup as a paste. Ebsen's voice can still be heard on the original soundtrack singing, "We're off to see the wizard." His face is nowhere in the finished film. He remained bitter about it, in a quiet way, for the rest of his life. Ironically, he would outlive every credited cast member of the film he was almost in. He struggled for years afterward, but he came back. Walt Disney cast him as George Russell, Davy Crockett's sidekick, in the 1954 miniseries that started the nationwide Davy Crockett craze. He worked steadily as a supporting player through the 50s. And then came Jed Clampett, and everything changed. The show peaked at 60 million weekly viewers and topped the ratings for its first 2 seasons. Ebsen remained devoted to creator Paul Henning, publicly saying he would stay on the show as long as Henning was writing for it. When The Beverly Hillbillies ended in 1971, Ebsen was 63 years old, and instead of retiring, he became a private investigator. From 1973 to 1980, he starred in Barnaby Jones on CBS as a soft-spoken, milk-drinking Los Angeles detective who had come out of retirement. That role, extraordinarily, made him a star for a second time. In the 1980s, he made peace, at least in some form, with Nancy Kulp before her death. He also quietly took up sailing, painting, and boat building. He wrote poetry. He composed songs. Buddy Ebsen died of complications from pneumonia on July 6, 2003, in Torrance, California, at the age of 95. He was survived by his wife Dorothy, 7 children, and a legacy that spanned dance, film, and television across nearly 70 years. The boy from Belleville, who had almost died on a soundstage in 1938, had lived long enough to see 2 full generations of American children grow up watching him on their television screens. He had lasted. And then he had lasted some more. And then he had turned that survival into something quietly extraordinary. There it is, the real story behind one of the most watched sitcoms in American television history. A family of hillbillies who struck oil and moved to a mansion. A cast of extraordinary people who lived behind the cameras, lives filled with tragedy and triumph, illness and reinvention, quiet grief and unexpected joy. Some of them died far too young, in ways almost impossibly hard to accept. Others lived into their 90s. One is still with us today, at 88 in the mountains of Nevada. They gave America 9 years of laughter and left behind stories that, more than half a century later, still have the power to surprise us. Every year, a new generation discovers Jed, Granny, Ellie Mae, and Jethro for the first time. And every one of the actors who brought them to life is now part of a shared American memory. A memory that lasts far longer than any of them expected when they showed up on that soundstage in 1962. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these actors was your favorite? Was it Buddy Ebsen's quiet, decent Jed? Was it Irene Ryan's tiny, tremendous Granny? Was it Donna Douglas's sweet Ellie Mae, or Max Baer Jr.'s unforgettable Jethro? Or was it Nancy Kulp's Miss Hathaway, or Raymond Bailey's Mr. Drysdale, or someone else entirely? Tell us in the comments below, and let us know where in the world you are watching from today. If you want to keep finding the real stories behind the classic shows and the people who created them, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. Every week, we go past the legend and into the life.